The laughter in the opulent ballroom was too polished, too expensive, too hollow. Clay Wayne gripped her serving tray with both hands, willing them to stop shaking. The chandeliers above glittered like 1,000 watchful eyes, and every guest looked capable of erasing her existence with a phone call. Keep your head down. Don't speak unless spoken to. And whatever you do, stay away from the Marauders. Her manager's voice still echoed in her head from the kitchen briefing. One wrong word, Clay, and you're gone. The Marauders make people disappear. She nodded solemnly when he said it, but standing here now, surrounded by tailored suits that cost more than her rent and jewelry that could pay her grandmother's medical bills 3 times over, those words felt less like a warning and more like prophecy. This was the event of the season. A private gathering hosted by the Marathi crime syndicate, the family that owned half the city's legitimate businesses and all of its shadows. Behind their real estate empire and import companies, everyone knew what the Marauders really were. Clay adjusted the bow tie at her collar, her dark brown skin catching the warm amber glow of the room. She looked calm, composed, professional. But her hands told a different story, trembling just enough to make the champagne flutes on her tray clink softly against each other. She wasn't supposed to be here. A last-minute call from the catering agency. Double pay for one night's work. That was all it took. Rent was 3 weeks late. Her grandmother's medical bills were getting uglier by the day. And sometimes survival came before sense. She just needed to get through the night unseen. That was all. But fate doesn't ask permission. Before we dive deeper into this story, take a moment to hit that like button if you love suspenseful, emotional stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next thrilling chapter. We also want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether it's your city, your country, or even just your favorite spot to watch these stories, we love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's get back to the story and see just how far courage can take someone when danger is closing in. The room shifted suddenly. The string quartet's melody softened to barely a whisper. Conversations died mid-sentence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. An elderly man entered through the grand double doors, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who'd commanded respect for decades. White hair swept back, sharp eyes that missed nothing, a tailored black suit that spoke of old-world authority. Don Vito Moratti, the patriarch, the man whose word was law in 6 languages. Beside him walked a younger man, tall, imposing, covered in tattoos that crept above his collar despite the formal setting. His son, Van Moratti, the heir who terrified people without ever raising his voice. The crowd parted as they moved through the ballroom, and Clay instinctively angled herself toward the wall, lowering her gaze to the marble floor. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. The footsteps stopped, right in front of her. Don Vito spoke, his voice carrying the melodic cadence of Italian, words Clay hadn't heard since she was small, sitting in her grandmother's kitchen while sauce simmered on the stove. Her mind reached back, through time, through memory. And before she could stop herself, before she could remember where she was and who surrounded her, she answered. Softly, fluently, in perfect Sicilian dialect. The room went silent. Music stopped mid-note. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Every conversation in the ballroom evaporated into the sudden, suffocating quiet. Don Vito's eyes widened with something Clay couldn't name. Surprise. Recognition. Something deeper. You speak the old tongue? He asked in English now, his voice deliberate, heavy with decades of power. Clay's heart slammed against her ribs. A little, sir. My grandmother taught me. Before he could respond, the younger man, Van, stepped forward, his dark eyes unreadable, assessing. Is there a problem, Padre? His voice was low, controlled, dangerous in its calm. Don Vito didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled, faint, thoughtful, and said something in rapid Sicilian. Clay caught fragments. Perfectly spoken. One of ours. Van's gaze shifted to her. Curious. Cautious. Calculating. My father would like you to join our table, he said. Clay blinked. Sir, I can't. I'm just serving drinks. He didn't smile. He didn't ask again. He simply took the tray from her hands and passed it to a nearby server. You're not serving anymore. Every instinct screamed run. But she found herself moving, guided firmly, but not roughly toward the head table. Across the room, her manager's face had gone pale, his hands making frantic gestures. Stop. Stop now. But refusing wasn't an option. Don Vito gestured to the chair beside him. Van took the seat on her other side, bracketing her between legacy and danger. What is your name, child? Don Vito asked, his tone almost gentle. Clay Wayne, she said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. He nodded slowly. Wayne. That is not Sicilian. But your tongue. His eyes studied her face. Your tongue belongs to my homeland. It belonged to my grandmother, Clay said carefully. She used to speak the dialect when she cooked. Said the recipes didn't work without the right words. Van's expression flickered, just for a moment, before returning to that unreadable mask. His father's face changed too, like he'd heard a ghost speak his name. And your grandmother's name? Don Vito asked quietly, leaning forward now. Celeste Ferraro. The air left the room. Van's hand tightened around his glass, knuckles going white. Don Vito's face transformed, shock, recognition, memory, and something that looked dangerously close to fear. He whispered the name again, this time in Sicilian, like a prayer or a curse. Ferraro. Around them, the entire table had gone still. Even the servers had stopped moving. Clay had no idea what she'd just said. No idea why that name, her grandmother's simple, common name, had made the most powerful man in the city look like the past had just walked through his door. All she knew was that every careful, invisible step of her life had just led her straight into something ancient, something dangerous, something she could never walk away from. And somewhere beneath the panic rising in her chest, a small voice whispered, "Isn't it strange how one innocent word can change everything? Because sometimes it's not the loudest moments that rewrite your fate. It's the quiet ones, the ones that seem harmless until the world shifts beneath your feet." Have you ever said something small, a word, a name, a truth, that you didn't realize would change everything? If you have, tell me in the comments what it taught you. Because for Clay Wayne, that one word was about to rewrite her entire story. Clay's grandmother used to say, "Some names carry weight. They don't just tell stories, they wake ghosts." Tonight, Clay had accidentally called one back to life. The moment she said Ferraro, the ballroom changed. Conversations resumed in careful fragments. Laughter that sounded forced, performative. Champagne glasses raised with hands that trembled just slightly. But at the head table, no one was pretending. Don Vito leaned toward her, his weathered face unreadable, eyes sharp as broken glass. "Your grandmother, Celeste Ferraro. You are certain of this name?" Clay nodded, confusion thick in her throat. "Yes, sir. She raised me after my parents died. She's the only family I have." Don Vito and Van exchanged a look, wordless, loaded, heavy with history Clay couldn't begin to understand. Van's jaw tightened, a muscle near his temple flexing once before he controlled it. "Ferraro," Don Vito murmured again, as if tasting a word he'd buried decades ago. "I once knew that name. We all did." Clay tried to smile politely, though her pulse thundered in her ears. It's a common Italian name, isn't it? Don Vito's chuckle was soft. Humorless. Not that one. He reached for his wine glass, his weathered fingers adorned with a gold ring that caught the chandelier light like old blood. Around them, the other guests at the head table had gone unnaturally still. Powerful men in expensive suits, women draped in silk and secrets, all watching her like she'd just confessed to a crime she didn't know she'd committed. Van spoke for the first time since she'd sat down, his voice low and controlled. "Where is your grandmother now?" "At home," Clay said quickly. She's not well. That's why I took this job. The medical bills." "What is wrong with her?" Don Vito interrupted, his tone sharpening. Clay hesitated. These weren't the kind of men you shared personal details with. But refusing to answer felt more dangerous than honesty. The doctors aren't sure. Her heart. Her memory. She's been getting worse. Something flickered across Don Vito's face. Pain, maybe. Or regret. He set down his glass with deliberate care and turned to his son. When he spoke, it was in rapid Sicilian. Too fast for Clay to follow, though she caught fragments. "Celeste." Impossible. After all these years. Van's response was clipped, cautious. His dark eyes never left Clay's face, studying her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve before it became a threat. Don Vito switched back to English, his voice gentler now but no less commanding. "Your grandmother. Does she speak of the old country? Of Sicily? Of her family?" Clay shook her head slowly. She used to. When I was little. But the last few years, she mostly talks about recipes. Old songs. Things that don't make much sense anymore. "And your parents?" Van asked. "Their names?" "My mother was Elena Wayne. She married my father, Marcus. They died in a car accident when I was 6. Clay's hands twisted in her lap beneath the table. "I don't understand why this matters. My grandmother's just—" "Your grandmother," Don Vito said quietly, "is not just anything." The weight in those words made Clay's breath catch. Around them, the ballroom carried on, music playing, champagne flowing, laughter echoing off marble and gold. But at this table, time had stopped. History had walked through the door, wearing a server's uniform and speaking a language it should know. Van leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You need to leave. Now." Clay blinked. What? "This conversation is over." Van's tone left no room for argument. He gestured to someone behind her, a man in a dark suit who appeared instantly at her elbow. "Marco will see you out." Don Vito raised a hand, stopping them both. "No." His eyes never left Clay's face. "She stays. We have much to discuss." The air between father and son crackled with unspoken tension. Clay sat frozen between them, suddenly certain that whatever she'd stumbled into was far more dangerous than anything her manager had warned her about. And somewhere in the back of her mind, her grandmother's voice whispered words she'd heard 1,000 times but never understood. "They took everything from us, mia cara. But they could never take our name." Van Moratti didn't argue with his father in public. Clay learned that much in the 30 seconds of loaded silence that followed. Instead, he stood with the fluid grace of a predator and gestured toward the ballroom's side exit with barely contained control. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Clay glanced at Don Vito, who nodded once, a dismissal that felt more like permission. She rose on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of every eye in the room tracking her movement, as Ben guided her away from the table with a hand that never quite touched her back but made escape impossible. The corridor beyond the ballroom was quieter, cooler, lined with dark wood panels and portraits of stern-faced men who looked like they'd built empires on other people's fear. Van stopped near a window overlooking the city lights, his reflection sharp in the glass. You need to understand something. His voice was dangerously calm. My father is a sentimental man. He sees ghosts where there are only shadows. Do you understand what I'm saying? Clay's throat felt tight. No, sir. He turned to face her fully, and up close she could see the tattoos that crept up his neck. Intricate, deliberate, telling stories she couldn't read. The name Ferraro means something in our world, something that should have stayed buried. And now you've spoken it in a room full of people who will remember. I didn't know. That's the problem. Van stepped closer, close enough that Clay had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You didn't know, which means you can't protect yourself from what comes next. So I'm going to make this very clear. Go home tonight. Take care of your grandmother. And forget everything you heard at that table. Clay's hands clenched at her sides. That's all I want. To go home. To be invisible again. Something flickered across his face. Not quite sympathy, but close. Then we understand each other. Marco will make sure you get to your car safely. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket and pressed it into her hand. If anyone contacts you, anyone, about tonight, about your grandmother's name, you call that number immediately. Who would contact me? Van's jaw tightened. People who should know you exist. Before Clay could ask what that meant, he was already walking away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until he disappeared back into the golden glow of the ballroom, leaving her alone with questions that tasted like danger. Marco, the silent man in the dark suit, appeared at her elbow like a shadow given form. He didn't speak, just gestured toward the service exit. Clay followed, her mind spinning, Van's card burning against her palm. By the time she reached the parking lot, her phone was already buzzing. Her manager's name flashed across the screen. Clay. His voice was tight, furious. What the hell did you do in there? I don't want to hear it. You're done. Don't come back. Don't call. Don't put me down as a reference. As far as I'm concerned, you never worked for us. The line went dead. Clay stood in the cold parking lot, still wearing her server uniform, staring at her phone like it might explain how her entire life had collapsed in under 2 hours. She'd been fired before. Restaurants were brutal, unpredictable, but never like this. Never with that edge of fear in someone's voice. She drove home in a daze, the city lights blurring past her window. Her apartment building looked smaller than usual, shabbier, the weight of unpaid bills suddenly crushing. Without that job, without the double pay from tonight, she had maybe 2 weeks before everything fell apart. Her grandmother was asleep when Clay checked on her, small and frail in the narrow bed, her breathing shallow but steady. Clay stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of the thin blanket, wondering what secrets this woman had kept buried for decades. Celeste Ferraro. Just a name. Just her grandmother's maiden name. How could that be dangerous? Clay barely slept. Every creak of the building made her jump. Every car that passed outside felt like a threat. Van's warning played on loop in her mind. People who shouldn't know you exist. When morning came, it arrived with a knock on her door. Clay checked the peephole and felt her stomach drop. A man stood in the hallway, different from Marco, but cut from the same cloth. Dark suit, expressionless face. The kind of stillness that came from knowing you were the most dangerous thing in the room. Miss Wayne. His voice carried through the door, polite but immovable. Mr. Moratti requests your presence at the estate. There's a car waiting downstairs. Clay's heart hammered against her ribs. Tell him I'm not interested. It's not a request, miss. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against the door. Of course it wasn't. Nothing about last night had been a request. Not the table. Not the questions. Not Van's warning. I need to check on my grandmother first. Mr. Moratti anticipated that concern. A nurse has been arranged for Mrs. Ferraro during your absence. She'll arrive within the hour. Clay's blood ran cold. They knew where she lived. They knew about her grandmother. They'd already made arrangements. Van's card was still in her pocket from last night. She could call the number, ask for help. But something told her the man on the other end would be the same one summoning her now. 5 minutes, she said through the door. Of course, miss. Clay changed quickly, her hands shaking as she pulled on jeans and a sweater. She left a note for her grandmother, had to run an errand. A nurse will be by to help. I'll be back soon. Even though she wasn't sure that last part was true. The car waiting outside was black, expensive, the kind with tinted windows that hid secrets. The driver opened the door without a word. Clay slid into the leather interior, her reflection staring back at her from the dark glass. As the city rolled past, morning light catching on buildings that had stood for a century, Clay thought about Van's words from last night. My father sees ghosts where there are only shadows. But what if the ghosts were real? What if her grandmother's whispered warnings and half-remembered stories weren't confusion or fading memory, but truth? The Moratti estate rose in the distance. Iron gates, stone walls, the kind of old money that didn't need to announce itself. Clay's hands twisted in her lap as the car pulled through the entrance. She was about to find out exactly what it meant to speak a name that should have stayed buried. The Moratti estate wasn't what Clay expected. No gaudy displays of wealth, no marble statues or gold-plated fixtures. Just old stone, dark wood, and the kind of quiet that came from generations of carefully kept secrets. The guard led her through corridors lined with photographs, black and white images of men in fedoras, women in pearls, families posed like they owned the world because they did. Van was waiting in what looked like a study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk of polished mahogany, and windows that overlooked gardens maintained with military precision. He stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, staring at something on the wall. Close the door, he said without turning. Clay did, her pulse hammering in her throat. Up close, in daylight, the room felt smaller, more intimate, more dangerous. Then finally turned to face her. He'd traded last night's formal suit for dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing more of the intricate tattoos that covered his forearms. Without the ballroom shadows, he looked younger, tired, like a man carrying weight he hadn't chosen. You want answers, he said. It wasn't a question. I want to go home. I want my life back. Clay's voice was steadier than she felt. I want to forget I ever heard the name Moratti. Too late for that. Van moved to the desk and opened a leather portfolio, pulling out a photograph. He held it up so she could see. Do you recognize anyone in this picture? Clay stepped closer, squinting at the faded image. It showed two families posed together, formal, serious, the way people used to photograph before smiling became mandatory. On one side, men who looked like younger versions of Don Vito. On the other, a family Clay didn't recognize. Except for one woman, young, beautiful, with dark eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. That's... Clay's breath caught. That's my grandmother. Celeste Ferraro. Taken in 1968, before everything fell apart. Van set the photograph on the desk between them. The Ferraros and the Morattis weren't just allies. We were family, bound by blood, marriage, mutual survival. For 3 generations, we controlled trade routes from Sicily to New York, legitimate and otherwise. Together, we were untouchable. Clay stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the vibrant young woman in the image with the frail, confused grandmother who couldn't remember what she'd eaten for breakfast. Van pulled out another document, yellowed with age, covered in elegant script and official seals. This is a marriage contract, signed by both families in 1969. Celeste Ferraro was engaged to my uncle, Antonio Moratti. The union was supposed to solidify the alliance, merge our territories completely. What happened? Van's jaw tightened. Betrayal. The kind that starts wars. He moved to the wall he'd been studying when she entered. It held a map. Old, detailed, marked with territories and trade routes. In 1971, someone fed information to the authorities. Names, dates, shipments, bank accounts. Everything we'd built came crashing down in a single night. Federal raids across 3 states. 27 arrests. Millions in seized assets. Clay's throat felt dry. And you think the Ferraros? We know they did. Van's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Evidence pointed directly to Celeste's father, Marco Ferraro. He'd been secretly negotiating with prosecutors, offering everything in exchange for immunity. But before they could complete the deal, the Ferraro family compound burned. Marco, his wife, his 2 sons, all dead. Only Celeste survived. The room felt colder suddenly. Clay wrapped her arms around herself. My grandmother would never. She was 19. Van turned to face her, his dark eyes sharp. She broke off the engagement 2 weeks before the raids. Disappeared the night of the fire. For 50 years, everyone assumed she died too. Or that she'd run to escape justice for her family's betrayal. That's not what happened. Then tell me what did. Van stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. Because yesterday, a ghost walked into my father's ballroom speaking perfect Sicilian dialect and carrying a name that should be extinct. And now I need to know who you really are and what you want. Clay's hands clenched into fists. I'm a waitress who's 3 weeks behind on rent. I don't want anything except to take care of my grandmother and survive. I didn't even know any of this existed until last night. Van studied her face like he was trying to read a language he'd forgotten. Finally, he pulled out one more document, newer, printed on modern paper. This is a DNA analysis commissioned by my father 20 years ago. He's been looking for Ferraro descendants since the fire. Every lead went cold. Until you. Clay's stomach dropped. You tested me? When? The champagne glass. Last night. Van's expression was unreadable. You're a direct maternal descendant of Marco Ferraro. Which means everything you've told me about your grandmother is true. Celeste didn't die. She built a new life. Had a daughter. That daughter had you. The implications crashed over Clay like a wave. So, what happens now? You've found your ghost. What do you want from me? Van was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to the old photograph of the 2 families standing together. My father wants reconciliation. He believes your grandmother holds the truth about what really happened that night. That maybe the Ferraros were framed. That the betrayal came from somewhere else. And what do you believe? I believe, Van said slowly, that history is written by whoever survives to tell it. And right now, you're the only Ferraro left alive. He picked up the photograph, studying it with something that might have been regret. Which makes you either the key to ending a 50-year-old war or the beginning of a new one. Clay's voice came out barely above a whisper. I didn't ask for this. No one ever does. Van set the photograph down and met her eyes. But like I told you last night, you spoke that name in a room full of people who will remember. The Morattis aren't the only ones who've been searching for Ferraro blood. And now that they know you exist, running won't save you. Then what will? Van's smile was thin, humorless. The truth. Whatever it costs. Outside the study windows, clouds had gathered over the estate, turning the morning gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Clay thought about her grandmother's confused rambling, her half-remembered recipes and songs, the way she sometimes spoke Italian to empty rooms like she was answering questions no one else could hear. Maybe she wasn't confused at all. Maybe she'd just been waiting 50 years for someone to ask the right questions. "I need to talk to her," Clay said. "My grandmother. She's the only one who knows what really happened." Van nodded slowly. "Tomorrow. We'll arrange transport. But tonight you stay here. Under protection. I'm not a prisoner." "No," Van agreed. "You're something much more dangerous. You're a Ferraro who doesn't know how to hide." And with those words, Clay understood that her life, the small, invisible, careful life she'd built, was gone. Burned away like the Ferraro compound 50 years ago, leaving only ashes and questions and a name that refused to die. Clay didn't sleep that night.
How could she?
The guest room Van had provided was larger than her entire apartment. Four-poster bed, silk sheets, windows that overlooked gardens she couldn't see in the dark. Everything about it screamed wealth and power and a world she didn't belong to. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her grandmother alone with a stranger hired to watch her. Thinking about photographs of families who'd smiled together before everything burned. Thinking about the weight of a name she'd carried her whole life without knowing it was a target on her back. Around 3 in the morning, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her door. Quick, purposeful, followed by urgent voices. Clay sat up, her heart racing, but the sounds faded before she could make out words. Something was wrong. She found out just how wrong at dawn. Van appeared at her door without knocking, his face harder than she'd seen it, the careful control from yesterday stripped away.
"Get dressed. We need to talk. Now."
Clay pulled on the clothes she'd worn yesterday. The guard hadn't let her go home for anything else, and followed him down corridors that felt different in daylight. Less intimidating. More like a prison wrapped in expensive wallpaper. The study was crowded this time. Don Vito sat behind the desk, looking older in the morning light, lines of worry etched deep around his eyes. 3 other men stood against the walls, not guards exactly, but close. The kind of men who solve problems without asking questions. Van closed the door behind Clay with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking. "We have a situation," Don Vito said without preamble. "Sit down, child." Clay sat, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. "What kind of situation?" Van moved to a laptop on the desk, turning it so she could see the screen. Security footage. Grainy, black and white, time-stamped from 4 hours ago. It showed a street corner near the estate, 3 cars parked at intervals, positioned with the kind of precision that wasn't coincidence. "These vehicles have been rotating positions since midnight," Van said, his voice tight. "Different cars, same pattern. Professional surveillance." Clay's stomach dropped. "Surveillance of what?" "Of this estate. Of you." Van clicked to another image, a closer shot of one of the cars. Even through the grainy footage, Clay could make out 2 men in the front seat, watching, waiting. The Chai family. Korean syndicate. They've been rivals of the Marathis for 20 years, fighting over territory, trade routes, political connections. Every move we make, they counter. Every alliance we build, they try to break. Don Vito leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the desk. "For 2 decades, they have been searching for leverage against us. Something powerful enough to tip the balance permanently in their favor. And last night," Ben continued, "you handed it to them. The moment you spoke that name in a room full of witnesses, word spread. By midnight, the Chai family knew exactly who you were and exactly what you meant to us." Clay's throat felt like it was closing. "I don't mean anything to you. I'm nobody. You're Ferraro blood." Don Vito's voice was gentle but unyielding. "In our world, that makes you everything. The Ferraros and Marathas together built an empire. The alliance was legendary, respected, feared. If that alliance can be restored, if a Ferraro stands beside a Marathi again, it sends a message that shifts power across 3 states. Van's jaw tightened. The Chai family can't allow that. They've spent years positioning themselves as the primary power in the region. A restored Ferraro-Marathi alliance would destroy everything they've built. So they're watching, Clay said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Waiting for what? For you to leave. Van's dark eyes held hers. For you to be vulnerable. Alone. Easy to take. The word hung in the air like a blade.
Take.
Not kill. Not eliminate.
Take.
Because she was more valuable alive than dead. A bargaining chip. A hostage. Leverage. Clay's hands started shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, trying to stop the tremor. You said I wasn't a prisoner.
You're not, Don Vito said.
But you're in danger. Mortal danger. The Chai family doesn't make empty threats. They've been known to kidnap family members of rivals, hold them for years, use them to extract concessions, force cooperation. Sometimes the hostages are returned. Sometimes. He let the sentence trail off, the implication clear. Clay thought about her grandmother. Alone. Vulnerable. They'll go after her too, won't they? If they can't get to me. Van exchanged a glance with his father.
We've already moved on that.
Your grandmother was transferred to a secure medical facility 2 hours ago. She's under guard, getting the care she needs, and completely off the grid. The Chai family doesn't know where she is. You moved her without telling me? Clay's voice rose, anger cutting through fear. She's confused. She'll be terrified. She's alive. Van cut in, his tone sharp. Which is what matters. The nurse we sent to your apartment reported suspicious activity on your street. A car that didn't belong. Men asking questions at the building entrance. We had minutes to act, not hours to debate. Clay closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the panic clawing at her chest. Everything was spiraling out of control. 24 hours ago, her biggest worry was unpaid rent. Now armed strangers were hunting her. Her grandmother had been taken to an undisclosed location, and she was trapped in a mansion surrounded by people who viewed her as either salvation or ammunition. What do they want from me? She asked quietly. The Chai family. If they take me, what's their endgame? Don Vito and Van exchanged another look. This one lasted longer, heavier with implication. They'll use you to force our hand, Don Vito finally said. Demand we surrender territory, dissolve alliances, hand over assets. Every time we refuse, they'll hurt you just enough to make the next demand more persuasive. And when they've extracted everything they can... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Van moved to the window, staring out at the gardens with his back rigid. There's another possibility. They might try to turn you. Convince you that we're the enemy, that the Marathas destroyed your family. Offer you revenge in exchange for cooperation. They're good at finding pressure points, exploiting trauma, making people believe their captors are their saviors. That's insane, Clay whispered. I don't even know who I am in all this. I'm not choosing sides in a war I just learned existed. You don't have to choose, Ben said, turning to face her. You already did. The moment you walked into that ballroom and spoke Sicilian to my father, you chose. The Chai family sees it that way. And now they're coming for you. Clay stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Then what am I supposed to do? Hide here forever? Let you use me as your alliance symbol while I wait for someone to put a bullet in me?
No.
Don Vito rose from his chair, moving around the desk with surprising grace for a man his age. He stopped in front of Clay, his expression softer than his son's, weighted with decades of regret. You survive, child. You learn who you truly are. You claim your birthright, and then you decide what to do with it. My birthright is medical bills and a dying grandmother, Clay shot back. Your birthright, Don Vito said quietly, is power. The kind that ended when the Ferraro line supposedly died. But you're still here. Still breathing. Still carrying that name. He placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. And that terrifies our enemies more than any weapon we possess. Outside, the surveillance cars continued their rotation. Patient. Professional. Waiting for Clay to make one wrong move, one fatal mistake. She was a waitress who'd learned to stay invisible. But invisibility wasn't an option anymore. Now she had to learn how to survive being seen. The alarm shattered the afternoon quiet like gunfire. Clay was in the guest room, staring at her reflection in the mirror and wondering who the hell she was anymore when the high-pitched wail cut through the estate. Red lights flashed in the hallway. Footsteps thundered on marble floors. Her door flew open. Van stood there, his expression cold and focused in a way that made Clay's blood run ice cold. We're moving.
Now.
What's happening? They breached the perimeter. Van grabbed her arm, pulling her into the corridor where guards were already mobilizing with the precision of a military operation. East Gate. 2 vehicles rammed through. We have maybe 3 minutes before they reach the main house. Clay's mind went blank with terror. The Chai family? Who else? Van guided her down a different hallway, away from the main entrance, toward what looked like a service corridor. Don Vito was already there, flanked by 4 guards, his weathered face carved from stone. We have a secure location prepared. Armored vehicles waiting at the west exit. But Clay dug her heels in, yanking her arm from Van's grip. My grandmother. Where is she? Safe, Van said sharply. I told you. You told me she was moved to a facility. You didn't tell me where. You didn't let me see her. Clay's voice cracked, fear transmuting into fury. I'm not going anywhere until I know she's actually protected and not just another lie to keep me compliant. Van's jaw tightened dangerously. Behind them, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the estate. Shouts. The unmistakable crack of gunfire. They were out of time. Clay, Van started.
No.
She planted her feet, every survival instinct screaming at her to run, but something deeper, fiercer keeping her rooted. You want me to trust you? To join your world, carry my family's name, be whatever symbol you need? Then prove I'm not just leverage to you too. Prove my grandmother matters. Don Vito stepped forward, his hand raised to silence his son. She's at St. Catherine's. Private medical compound in the North Woods. 24-hour care, armed security, completely off any grid the Chai family can access. His gray eyes held Clay's, steady and honest. I give you my word, on my family's name, on my own blood, she is safe and will remain so. I want to see her. After we survive the next 10 minutes, Van growled, you can see anyone you want. But right now, we move or we die. Choose. More gunfire. Closer now. Someone shouted in Korean. Orders being barked, coordinated, professional. These weren't amateurs. These were soldiers executing a plan. Clay looked at Van, then at Don Vito, then at the corridor behind them where shadows moved with lethal intent. Every choice in her life had led to this moment. Every decision to stay small, stay invisible, stay safe, all of it obliterated in 48 hours. If anything happens to her, Clay said quietly, I will burn your entire world down. I don't care what name I carry, or what alliance you think I represent. She's all I have. Van's expression shifted, surprise, maybe respect. Understood. Now move. They ran. The west corridor was narrower, older, the kind of passage built when estates needed escape routes from angry mobs or rival families. Van led the way, one hand on Clay's back, the other resting on something beneath his jacket that she knew without seeing was a weapon. They burst through a service door into cold afternoon air. 3 black SUVs idled in a hidden courtyard, engines running, doors already open. Guards surrounded them in a defensive formation. Go, go, go. Van shoved Clay into the middle vehicle. Don Vito climbed in beside her. Van took the front passenger seat, already on his phone barking orders in rapid Korean and Italian. The convoy moved before the doors even closed, tires squealing on pavement, accelerating through a gate Clay hadn't known existed. Behind them, the estate erupted with the sound of tactical assault, more gunfire, shouting, the organized chaos of professionals clashing. Clay twisted in her seat, watching the only sanctuary she'd known for the past day disappear behind a screen of trees. Are your people going to be okay? They're trained for this, Van said without turning. The Chai family wanted to make a statement. We'll make one back. Don Vito's hand found Clay's, squeezing once. Welcome to our world, child. This is what it means to carry power. Everyone wants to take it from you. The convoy drove for 90 minutes, changing routes twice, doubling back, using counter-surveillance techniques Clay only recognized from movies. Van stayed on the phone the entire time, receiving updates, issuing commands, his voice never rising above that deadly calm that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting. Finally, they turned onto an unmarked road that wound through dense forest. The trees here were old, thick, the kind that had witnessed centuries. A gate appeared, understated, sophisticated, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking. It opened silently as they approached. The compound beyond took Clay's breath away. It wasn't a hospital. It was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. Low stone buildings arranged around a central courtyard, surrounded by walls that looked decorative but were clearly defensive. Guards patrolled in pairs, armed but discreet. Medical staff in crisp white coats moved between buildings with calm efficiency. St. Catherine's, Don Vito said. Built 50 years ago as a private facility for families like ours. People who need medical care without questions, without records, without interference. He gestured to the main building. Your grandmother is in the East Wing. The best doctor's money can buy. Whatever she needs, she'll have. The SUV stopped in front of the main entrance. Clay was out before anyone could stop her, her legs unsteady, her heart hammering. A woman in a white coat approached, middle-aged, kind eyes, the demeanor of someone who'd seen everything and judged nothing. Miss Wayne, I'm Dr. Reyes. Your grandmother is stable and resting comfortably. Would you like to see her? Clay nodded, not trusting her voice. The room was peaceful. Afternoon light filtered through gauze curtains. Medical equipment hummed softly. And there, in a bed that looked infinitely more comfortable than anything in Clay's apartment, lay her grandmother. Celeste Ferraro looked smaller somehow.
Frilier.
But her breathing was steady, and the tight lines of pain that had marked her face for months were smoothed away. Clay sank into the chair beside the bed, taking her grandmother's hand. It felt warm, real, alive. I'm here, Nana, she whispered. I'm here. Behind her, Van and Don Vito waited in the doorway, giving her space but making their presence known. The compound is secure, Van said quietly. No one gets in without clearance. No one gets out without authorization. She'll have round-the-clock care, security, everything she needs. Clay didn't turn around. And the price. You already know the price. Van's voice was gentler than she'd heard it. You stay. You learn. You become what the Ferraro name demands. Clay looked down at her grandmother's face, peaceful in medication-induced sleep. She thought about their tiny apartment, about medical bills and late rent and working double shifts just to survive. She thought about the life she'd built on being invisible, unremarkable, safe. That life was gone, burned away the moment she'd spoken Sicilian to a man who remembered ghosts. "I'll stay," Clay said. "Not for your alliance. Not for your war with the Chai family. I'll stay because this is the only way to keep her alive." She finally turned to meet Van's eyes. "But understand something. I'm not your symbol. I'm not your weapon. I'm a Ferraro because that's the name I was born with, but what I do with it, that's mine to decide." Don Vito smiled, faint but genuine. Spoken like your grandmother would have 50 years ago. Van's expression was harder to read. "Fair enough. But the Chai family won't care about your intentions. They'll come for you anyway." "Then I guess," Clay said, her hand tightening around her grandmother's, "you better teach me how to fight back." Outside, the compound walls stood strong against the gathering dusk. Somewhere beyond them, enemies circled and waited. But here, in this stolen moment of peace, Clay Wayne made a choice that would echo across decades of buried history. She would survive. She would protect what mattered. And she would learn what it truly meant to be a Ferraro. Clay spent 3 days at St. Catherine's before Van came for her. 3 days watching her grandmother sleep more peacefully than she had in years. 3 days learning that the doctors here didn't just treat symptoms, they actually cared, actually listened, actually had resources beyond take these pills and hope. 3 days understanding exactly what kind of life money could buy and hating how much she wanted it for the woman who'd raised her. On the 4th morning, Van appeared at her grandmother's door wearing dark slacks and a charcoal sweater that somehow made him look both dangerous and approachable. The tattoos on his forearms were fully visible now. She could make out symbols, dates, names written in scripts she couldn't read. "She's stable," Van said, glancing at Celeste's sleeping form. "Dr. Reyes says she's responding well to the new treatment protocol." Clay nodded, not taking her eyes off her grandmother's face. "What does that cost? All of this?" "Don't worry about cost. That's not an answer." Clay finally looked at him. "Everything has a price. I need to know what I'm agreeing to pay." Van's expression softened slightly. "The ledger. That's what this costs. Your grandmother's care, your protection, everything we're providing. It's an investment in finding what was lost." "You mentioned that before. A ledger. Come with me." Van gestured toward the door. "There's something you need to see." Clay hesitated, looking back at her grandmother. A nurse sat in the corner, reading quietly, attentive without being intrusive. They'd been good to Celeste here. Better than Clay could have managed alone. She stood, following Van through corridors that felt less like a medical facility and more like an upscale hotel. They walked to a different wing entirely, one with heavier security, guards at checkpoints, biometric scanners, doors that required codes and fingerprints to open. "This is the archive," Van explained as they descended stairs into what felt like a basement carved from bedrock. "Every family like ours keeps one. Records, contracts, evidence we might need someday. Insurance policies written in blood and ink." The room they entered took Clay's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, filing cabinets that looked like they'd witnessed decades, display cases holding artifacts that belonged in museums. The air smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals and secrets kept too long. Van led her to a central table where a single object waited under glass, a seal, ancient and intricate, carved from what looked like jade or dark stone. The design was complex, 2 family crests intertwined, surrounded by text in Italian so old Clay could barely recognize the letters. "The Ferraro Maratti seal," Van said quietly. created in 1898 when our families first allied. Every major agreement, every territory division, every partnership was marked with this seal. It represented unity, trust, mutual protection. Clay studied the artifact, struck by how something so small could carry so much weight. What happened to it? After the fire, my grandfather recovered it from the ruins, kept it as a reminder of what we'd lost. Van moved to a shelf, pulling down a leather portfolio similar to the one he'd shown her in the study. These are the agreements that seal validated. Trade routes, territory maps, business partnerships. All legitimate on the surface, all carrying additional implications beneath. He spread documents across the table, contracts signed by men whose names Clay recognized from history books, photographs of warehouses and shipping manifests, maps marked with codes and symbols. For 70 years, this system worked perfectly, Van continued. The Ferraros controlled the Italian connections, Sicily, Naples, the old country networks. The Marathas handled the Korean and Asian routes, Seoul, Hong Kong, everything across the Pacific. Together, we were untouchable. Import, export, distribution, protection. Everything flowed through both families. Until the betrayal, Clay said. Until the betrayal. Van's jaw tightened. When the Ferraro compound burned, something else burned with it. The master ledger, a complete record of every operation, every partner, every account, every route. Codes to access offshore holdings. Names of politicians and judges on the payroll. Locations of safe houses and supply chains. Everything. Clay felt cold suddenly. That's what you're really after. Not reconciliation. Not healing old wounds. You want that ledger. We need it. Van met her eyes, his expression intense. Without it, half our empire is built on memory and guesswork. We've reconstructed what we could over 50 years, but there are gaps. Accounts we can't access. Partnerships we can't prove. Territory claims we can't enforce. That ledger is worth more than every dollar in our legitimate businesses combined. And you think my grandmother knows where it is? I think your grandmother is the only person who could know. Van pulled out another photograph, this one showing a young Celeste holding a small leather-bound book, standing in what looked like a library. This was taken 6 months before the fire. See what she's holding. Clay leaned closer. The book in young Celeste's hands was nondescript, but the way she held it, carefully, protectively, suggested it was important. That could be anything, Clay said. It could be. Van's voice dropped lower. Or it could be the ledger. Marco Ferraro was paranoid, brilliant, and deeply protective of family legacy. If he suspected betrayal, if he knew federal raids were coming, he would have moved the ledger somewhere safe. Somewhere only family could find it. Clay's mind raced. He died in the fire. You said everyone died except my grandmother. Everyone died, Van agreed. But Celeste survived. And within a week, she'd vanished completely. New name, new city, new life. She erased herself so thoroughly it took 50 years for anyone to find a trace. He paused, studying Clay's face. That kind of disappearance takes resources. Money. Help. Planning. You think she took the ledger with her? I think she took something. Maybe the ledger itself. Maybe instructions for finding it. Maybe codes, keys, coordinates, something that only a Ferraro would understand. Van moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the quiet archive. You said your grandmother taught you Sicilian. That she used to tell you stories, teach you recipes, sing old songs. Clay nodded slowly, memory stirring. She was always very specific about certain things. The way ingredients had to be measured, the order they had to be added. She'd get upset if I did it wrong. Recipes, Ben said softly, can be codes. Songs can be mnemonics. Stories can be maps. His dark eyes held hers. Your childhood, Clay. Everything your grandmother taught you. It might not have been just family tradition. It might have been her way of preserving something vital, hiding it in plain sight, waiting for someone who carried Ferraro blood to understand. The implications crashed over Clay like ice water. Every evening in her grandmother's kitchen, every carefully measured ingredient, every verse of songs in Sicilian she'd memorized phonetically without understanding. Every story about the old country that seemed to circle back to specific places, specific names, specific details. You're saying she was teaching me how to find it, Clay whispered, without ever telling me what I was looking for. I'm saying it's possible. Van's voice was gentle now, almost apologetic. And if it's true, you're the only person alive who has those keys locked in your memory. Clay turned back to the seal under glass, watching light refract through the ancient stone. What if I can't remember? What if whatever she taught me is just lost? Then we figured out together. Van stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the tension coiled in his frame. But I've seen how you move through the world, Clay. How you notice things, remember details, piece together patterns. That's not accident. That's training. Whether you knew it or not, Celeste Ferraro was preparing you for this moment. Outside the archive, the compound continued its careful routines. Doctors made rounds. Guards patrolled. Her grandmother slept peacefully in a room that cost more per night than Clay used to make in a month. And here, in this underground vault of secrets, Clay Wayne began to understand that her entire life had been a puzzle she was only now learning to see. Where do we start? She asked. Van smiled, genuine this time, touched with something that might have been hope. With your memories. Every recipe, every song, every story. We write them down, break them apart, look for patterns. He gestured to the archive around them. This is your family's history too. Everything the Ferraros built, everything they protected. It's time you learned what that legacy actually means. Clay thought about her grandmother's wrinkled hands guiding hers through the motions of cooking. The way she'd insisted certain words had to be pronounced exactly right. The stories that always ended with cryptic phrases like, "And that's where the old ones kept their treasures," or, "Remember the number, cara mia. Numbers are everything." Maybe it hadn't been confusion at all. Maybe it had been the most deliberate thing Celeste Ferraro had ever done, hiding a fortune in plain sight, encoded in the daily rituals of raising a granddaughter who would someday need to understand. Okay, Clay said. Let's find out what she wanted me to know. The dress arrived 3 days before the dinner. Clay stared at it hanging in her room at the compound, deep emerald silk that caught the light like water, elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of garment that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. A note in Don Vito's careful handwriting lay beside it. Every queen needs her armor. I'm not going, Clay said when Van appeared that evening to check on her progress with the memory exercises. They'd spent hours in the archive, Clay reciting recipes and songs while Van recorded everything, looking for patterns that might unlock her grandmother's secrets. Van leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Yes, you are. I'm a waitress, Van. I served people like whoever's coming to this dinner. I don't belong in that room. You're Ferraro. His voice was firm but not unkind. And whether you like it or not, these people need to see you. Need to know you're real. Clay sank onto the edge of the bed, exhaustion settling into her bones.
Why?
What difference does it make if they see me? Van moved into the room, sitting in the chair opposite her with the careful distance he always maintained, close enough to talk, far enough to let her breathe. Power in our world isn't just about money or muscle. It's about perception. Right now, the Chai family is telling everyone that the Marathas are weak, fractured, living on past glory. They're positioning themselves as the future. And I'm supposed to change that by wearing a fancy dress? You're supposed to change that by existing. Van's dark eyes held hers. For 50 years, the Ferraro line was extinct.
Dead.
Buried. A legend people told to explain why the Maraudis never fully recovered their former power. But now you're here, living proof that the alliance can be restored, that the old bloodline survived, that what was broken can be rebuilt. Clay looked at the emerald dress, at the life it represented. What if I don't want to be your symbol? Then be your own symbol. Van's voice softened. But understand, these families we're meeting with, they're the ones who can tip the balance. If they believe the Ferraro-Maradi alliance is real, they'll align with us. If they doubt it, they'll hedge their bets with the Chai family. This dinner determines whether we have allies or enemies. No pressure then. Van's lips twitched, almost a smile. You've survived everything thrown at you so far. One dinner with some old men in expensive suits should be easy. It wasn't easy. The dinner was held at a private estate north of a city, the kind of place that didn't exist on any map. Clay arrived with Van and Don Vito in an armored car, her hands trembling inside the silk gloves that matched her dress. She'd let someone style her hair, pulled back in an elegant twist that felt nothing like her usual tight bun, and apply makeup that made her look older, more composed, more like someone who belonged here. The dining room was stunning. Crystal chandeliers, a table that could seat 30, place settings that probably cost more than her old apartment. Men in tailored suits stood in clusters, speaking in low voices, their eyes sharp and assessing. They all turned when Clay entered. The silence felt like judgment, like scrutiny, like a test she hadn't studied for. Don Vito's hand found her elbow, steadying her. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "May I present Celeste's granddaughter, Clay Ferraro Wayne." The use of her grandmother's name, Ferraro placed deliberately before Wayne, made something shift in the room. Several men exchanged glances. One older gentleman with silver hair and sharp features stepped forward. "Ferraro," he repeated, accent thick with something Eastern European. "We were told this line was extinct." "So were we," Don Vito said smoothly. "But as you can see, reports of the family's demise were premature." Another man approached, younger, Japanese maybe, with calculating eyes. "She speaks the old tongue?" Before Don Vito could answer, Clay found her voice. The Sicilian words came easier now after days in the archive, after hours of reciting her grandmother's phrases. "I speak enough to honor my grandmother's memory." The Japanese man's eyebrows rose. Several others nodded approvingly. Van appeared at Clay's other side, creating a united front. "Miss Ferraro has been under Maradi protection since her identity was confirmed. We consider any threat to her a threat to our family directly." The message was clear. Touch her, and you're declaring war. Dinner was a careful dance of politics disguised as polite conversation. Clay sat between Don Vito and Van, positioned deliberately at the center of the table like a cornerstone. She answered questions carefully, letting Don Vito guide her through the treacherous waters of syndicate diplomacy. "Your grandmother," the silver-haired man, introduced as Victor Volkov, said between courses. "Celeste Ferraro. I met her once, many years ago. She had your eyes. That same careful way of watching everything." Clay's breath caught. "You knew her?" "Briefly. Before the fire." Victor's expression was unreadable. She was to marry a Maradi son, unite the families. Then everything burned. He studied Clay over his wine glass. "Tell me, does she speak of those days?" It was a test. Clay could feel it. "She speaks of many things. Memory is difficult for her now. But she taught me what mattered, the language, the traditions, the importance of family." And do you consider the Maradas family now? The room went quiet, everyone watching her answer. This was the real question, the one that mattered. Clay felt Van tense beside her, Don Vito's hand steady on the table near hers. She thought about her grandmother sleeping peacefully at St. Catherine's, about the attack on the estate, the Chai family circling like wolves, about 3 days of Van patiently helping her decode memories, treating her like a person instead of a weapon. I consider them allies, Clay said carefully. And in this world, I'm learning that's worth more than blood. Victor smiled, genuine approving. Wise answer. Your grandmother taught you well. The rest of the dinner flowed easier after that. Agreements were hinted at, alliances suggested, the delicate work of shifting power conducted over dessert and coffee. By the time they left, Clay had been photographed with every family head present, her presence documented, her existence validated. In the car ride back, Don Vito looked satisfied.
You did well, child.
Better than I hoped. I felt like a show pony. You were, Van said bluntly, but an effective one. By morning, everyone in our world will know the Ferraro line survived. The Chai family's narrative about Marathi weakness just crumbled. Clay leaned back against the leather seat, exhausted. And now we wait, Don Vito said. Wait to see who approaches us with renewed loyalty and who shows their true allegiance by staying silent. Van's phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression darkening. Or we don't wait. We have a problem. What kind of problem?
Clay asked.
Van turned the phone so she could see the screen, a message in Korean, accompanied by a photograph. The photograph showed a building she recognized immediately, her old apartment complex. The Chai family just made their move, Van said grimly. They raided your apartment, tore it apart looking for anything connected to your grandmother. Clay's stomach dropped. Did they find anything? That's what worries me. Van's jaw tightened. Your grandmother lived in that apartment for 20 years. If she hid something there, codes, documents, pieces of the puzzle, they might have found it first. Don Vito leaned forward. Or they found nothing, and they're getting desperate. His gray eyes met Clay's. Either way, tonight changed the game. You're not just a rumor anymore. You're real, you're protected, and you're dangerous to their plans. Clay looked down at the emerald dress, at the gloves on her hands, at the reflection of someone she barely recognized in the car window. She'd spent her whole life trying to be invisible. Now she was the most visible person in a very dangerous world. What happens next? She asked quietly. Van's expression was grim. We find the ledger before they do. Because if the Chai family gets to it first, everything your grandmother protected, everything she hid for 50 years, becomes a weapon aimed directly at us. The car drove through the night, carrying Clay back to the compound, back to the archive, back to the memories that might be the only key to surviving what came next. She'd become visible. Now she had to become invaluable. Before someone decided she was worth more dead than alive. The betrayal came from inside. Clay was in the archive when Van burst through the door, his face carved from stone, rage barely contained beneath the surface. 2 guards flanked him, dragging a third man between them. One of the compound's security team, the one who'd smiled at Clay every morning when she passed.
Carlo.
Tell her, Van said, his voice deadly quiet. Carlo's face was bruised, bleeding from a split lip. He wouldn't meet Clay's eyes. Tell her what you told the Chai family. Carlo's voice came out broken. Everything. Guard rotations. Security protocols. Miss Ferraro's daily schedule. He finally looked up at Clay, something like regret in his eyes. They offered me enough money to disappear. Start over somewhere they'd never find me. Clay felt cold. How long? Since the dinner. 3 days. Carlo's shoulders sagged. I'm sorry. I didn't think. You didn't think they'd use that information to kill her? Van's hand moved to his waist, and Clay realized with sick certainty that he was armed and considering using it. Or you didn't care? Don Vito appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim. Take him to the holding room. We'll deal with him after we've secured the situation. The guards dragged Carlo away. His pleas echoed down the corridor until a door slammed, cutting them off. Van turned to Clay, his expression softening slightly. Pack light. We're moving you again. No. Clay stood, her mind racing. No more running. No more reacting. We need to find the ledger now before they do. Clay. They raided my apartment. They have someone inside your compound. They're closing in from every angle. Clay moved to the table, where she'd spent days recording her grandmother's recipes and songs, pages and pages of memories transcribed and analyzed. We've been doing this wrong, looking for patterns in everything. But what if it's not about patterns? What if it's simpler? Van exchanged a glance with his father. What are you thinking? Clay's hands trembled as she reached for her bag, pulling out the one thing she'd brought from home, a small jewelry box. Inside lay a tarnished silver pendant, a family heirloom her grandmother had pressed into her hands years ago with the words, "Keep this close, Kara. It's all that's left of who we were." She'd never paid much attention to it. The chain was broken, the silver oxidized, the design on its face too worn to make out clearly. Just another piece of costume jewelry from an old woman's vanity. But now, holding it under the archive's bright lights, Clay saw something she'd missed. The design wasn't random scratches from age. It was deliberate. Numbers and letters, so small they were nearly invisible, etched into the crest in a spiral pattern. Look at this. She handed the pendant to Van. My grandmother gave this to me when I was 16. Said it belonged to her mother, and her mother before that. All that's left of who we were. Van studied it, then moved to a magnifying station used for examining old documents. Under magnification, the etchings became clear. Numbers.
Coordinates, maybe.
Or an address encoded in the old style. 14. Van read slowly. P14. And here, these look like map coordinates, but partial. Like they're missing context. Don Vito leaned over his son's shoulder, his eyes sharp despite his age. Pier 14. The old shipping district. The Ferraros owned warehouses there before the fire. Clay's heart hammered. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the place where numbers sleep. I thought she meant a bank, or maybe she was just confused. But what if she meant literally a place where she stored numbers, codes, the ledger? Pier 14 was abandoned after the raids in 71, Don Vito said. Seized by the government, then sold at auction when they couldn't prove criminal activity. By then, both our families had moved on. The buildings have been condemned for years. Perfect place to hide something, Van said. Forgotten. Overlooked. Everyone assumed anything valuable burned in the compound fire. Clay touched the pendant, feeling the weight of it differently now. She gave me the key. She's been giving me pieces my whole life, waiting for me to be old enough to understand. Van was already moving, pulling out his phone, barking orders in Korean. Get me schematics for Pier 14. Satellite images. And I want 4 teams mobilized in 10 minutes. Don Vito held up a hand. If Carlo told the Chai family everything they know about the pendant, they know we've been working with Clay's memories. Then they're already on their way there, Van finished grimly. He turned to Clay. You should stay here. Let us handle this. No. Clay's voice was firm. My grandmother hid this. If there are codes, traps, anything that needs Ferraro knowledge to navigate, you'll need me there. It's too dangerous. Everything's been dangerous since I spoke Sicilian at your father's gala. Clay met Van's eyes, seeing the calculation there, the protectiveness warring with pragmatism. You said I need to become what the Ferraro name demands. Well, this is what it demands. Stop protecting me and start trusting me. Something shifted in Van's expression. Respect, maybe. Or recognition that she was right.
Fine.
But you stay close to me. You follow orders. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Understood. 20 minutes later, they were in an SUV racing toward the waterfront. Don Vito had stayed at the compound, too valuable to risk in what might become a firefight. Van sat beside Clay in the back, checking weapons with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The Chai family won't hesitate to kill you if they're there first, he said without looking up. Ledger or no ledger, you're a threat to them. If it comes down to choosing between the information and your life. We get both, Clay interrupted. We didn't come this far to lose now. Then finally looked at her, something unreadable in his dark eyes. You've changed. Since that first night. I had to. Clay watched the city blur past the window, neon and shadows and lives lived in ignorance of the war being fought beneath the surface. You were right. I can't be invisible anymore. So, I might as well be dangerous. The waterfront district was exactly as described, abandoned, industrial, the kind of place the city had forgotten. Pier 14 rose in the distance, skeletal and dark against the night sky. Their convoy killed the lights a block out, approaching on foot, weapons drawn. Van's hand found Clay's arm, holding her back. Movement. East side. 3 vehicles. Clay's stomach dropped. They're already here. Of course they are. Van's jaw tightened. Carlo probably called them the moment we figured out the pendant. They've had a head start. Ahead, figures moved through the darkness. Organized, professional, sweeping the warehouse with tactical precision. The Chai family had brought soldiers. Van pulled Clay behind a shipping container, his body shielding hers. We can't go in directly. They'll have the main entrance covered. There has to be another way. Clay closed her eyes, reaching for memories. Her grandmother's stories. She used to talk about the door the water forgot. I thought it was poetic. But this is a pier. What if? The water access, Van finished. Old piers like this had loading docks that opened to the river. If it's not sealed, we could come in from below. They moved along the pier's edge, away from the main building, toward the dark water, where the structure's supports disappeared into the depths. Van found it a rusted gate, half submerged, just large enough for someone to slip through. Stay behind me, he said. Always, Clay replied. They descended into darkness, into cold water that reached their waists, into the forgotten spaces where her grandmother had hidden the truth 50 years ago. Above them, footsteps echoed. Voices shouted in Korean. The Chai family was close. But so was the ledger. And Clay Wayne, shy waitress turned reluctant heiress, was about to discover what her grandmother had protected all these years. Even if she had to walk through hell to find it. The warehouse at Pier 14 smelled like salt and rust and decades of forgotten secrets. Clay's hands trembled as she held her grandmother's pendant up to the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. The Ferraro crest etched into the silver caught the glow, revealing coordinates she'd traced 100 times since childhood, without understanding what they meant. Van stood beside her, his presence solid and certain in the darkness. There, he said quietly, pointing to a section of the wall where the brick pattern looked just slightly wrong. That's it. Clay approached, her heart hammering against her ribs. The pendant grew warm in her palm as she pressed it against an indentation in the wall, a perfect match. Something inside the mechanism clicked, groaned, then shifted. A section of bricks swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment lined with dust and time. Inside sat a leather-bound ledger, its cover marked with both the Ferraro and Marathi crests intertwined. Van reached for it, but Clay's hand got there first. She lifted it carefully, reverently, feeling the weight of generations in her hands. This was what everyone had been searching for, what people had died protecting, what her grandmother had hidden in plain sight through recipes and childhood stories. "Open it," Van said, his voice rough with something between dread and hope. Clay's fingers found the clasp. The pages fell open, revealing neat handwriting in Italian and Sicilian, names, dates, trade routes, shipments. But there was more. Letters. Confessions. Testimonies that painted a picture far more complicated than the simple story of betrayal she'd been told. The Ferraro family hadn't just been allies. They'd been the moral center, the ones who'd tried to steer the alliance away from the darkest trades, human trafficking, arms dealing to terrorist cells, poison disguised as medicine. And when they'd refused to participate, when they'd threatened to expose everything to authorities, they hadn't just been abandoned. They'd been systematically destroyed. "Van." Clay's voice cracked as she read. "Van, this says." "I know what it says." The voice came from the warehouse entrance. Don Vito Marathi stood silhouetted against the fading daylight, his silver cane tapping against the concrete floor as he walked toward them. He looked older somehow, the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. Van stepped in front of Clay instinctively, his body a shield. "Father, you shouldn't be here. Neither should you." Don Vito's gaze moved to the ledger in Clay's hands. "But here we all are, standing in the ruins of choices made long before you were born." Clay found her voice, though it shook. You knew what happened to my family." Don Vito stopped a few feet away, his expression carved from stone and regret. "I was 25 years old. My father was Don then. He made the decision. I didn't stop him." He paused, his weathered fingers tightening on his cane. "The Ferraros wanted out. They wanted to take their evidence and their conscience and walk away. My father couldn't allow that. So he made them disappear. All of them, except one." "Celeste," Clay whispered. "Your grandmother. She was just a girl, 16 years old. She ran the night before the final purge." Don Vito's voice carried the weight of 50 years of guilt. "I helped her escape. Gave her new papers, a new name, enough money to start over. I told myself that made it right. That saving one life balanced the scales." Van's voice was cold, harder than Clay had ever heard it. "You let me believe the Ferraros betrayed us. You built our family's legacy on that lie." "I built our family's survival on that lie," Don Vito corrected. "The Chai family would have consumed us if they'd known the truth, that we were weak enough to let morality interfere with profit, that we'd splintered from within." He looked at Clay, something raw and human breaking through his armor. "I am not asking for forgiveness. I'm simply telling you what cannot be changed." Clay felt the ledger burning in her hands. She could expose everything, bring down the entire Marathi Empire, watch it crumble under the weight of its own sins. The Chai family would descend like vultures, tearing apart what remained. And nothing would change. More violence, more death. The cycle continuing forever, fed by revenge that fed more revenge. She thought of her grandmother, who'd spent 50 years hiding, teaching her granddaughter Sicilian through recipes and songs, waiting for the day when the truth might finally matter. Celeste hadn't taught her the language for vengeance. She taught it for something else entirely. For choice. Clay closed the ledger carefully. "This ends now," she said quietly. "Not with more blood. Not with revenge. It ends with the truth used the right way." Van turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. Clay, the Chai family wants leverage. They want to tear you apart. She looked between Van and Don Vito. But what if we give them something they can't fight? A united front. Ferraro and Moratti, standing together. Not hiding the past, but acknowledging it and choosing something different. Don Vito's expression shifted. Surprise, then something that might have been relief. You would align yourself with us? After everything? I would align myself with the truth, Clay said. And with a future that doesn't require my grandmother to keep hiding. That doesn't require anyone else's grandmother to disappear. She looked at Van, her voice steadying. We use this ledger to create transparency. Real alliances based on legitimate business, not blood and fear. We dismantle what shouldn't exist and build something that can actually last. Van's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. That's dangerous. Revolutionary. It'll make enemies. We already have enemies, Clay said. At least this way, we choose what we're fighting for. Don Vito was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Your grandmother would have said the same thing. 50 years ago, she tried to tell us there was another way. His voice roughened. Perhaps it takes a new generation to finally listen. Clay tucked the ledger against her chest. Outside, the sun was setting over the pier, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, about the dialect that had saved her life and changed it forever, about the invisible waitress who'd accidentally called a ghost back to life. Sometimes the loudest act of courage is choosing peace when violence would be easier. Van's hand squeezed hers gently. Together, he asked quietly. Clay looked at him. This man trying to escape his family's legacy, this dangerous, complicated person who'd somehow become her future. Together, she confirmed. And for the first time since that night in the ballroom, Clay Wayne chose to be visible. Chose to stand in the light. Chose a life built on truth instead of fear. The past would always be there, written in that ledger. But the future? That was something they could write themselves. The warehouse at Pier 14 smelled like salt and rust and decades of forgotten secrets. Clay's hands trembled as she held her grandmother's pendant up to the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. The Ferraro crest etched into the silver caught the glow, revealing coordinates she'd traced 100 times since childhood, without understanding what they meant. Van stood beside her, his presence solid and certain in the darkness. There, he said quietly, pointing to a section of the wall where the brick pattern looked just slightly wrong. That's it. Clay approached, her heart hammering against her ribs. The pendant grew warm in her palm as she pressed it against an indentation in the wall, a perfect match. Something inside the mechanism clicked, groaned, then shifted. A section of bricks swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment lined with dust and time. Inside sat a leather-bound ledger, its cover marked with both the Ferraro and Moratti crests intertwined. Van reached for it, but Clay's hand got there first. She lifted it carefully, reverently, feeling the weight of generations in her hands. This was what everyone had been searching for, what people had died protecting, what her grandmother had hidden in plain sight through recipes and childhood stories. Open it, Ben said, his voice rough with something between dread and hope. Clay's fingers found the clasp. The pages fell open, revealing neat handwriting in Italian and Sicilian, names, dates, trade routes, shipments. But there was more. Letters, confessions, testimonies that painted a picture far more complicated than the simple story of betrayal she'd been told. The Ferraro family hadn't just been allies. They'd been the moral center, the ones who'd tried to steer the alliance away from the darkest trades, human trafficking, arms dealing to terror cells, poison disguised as medicine. And when they'd refused to participate, when they'd threatened to expose everything to authorities, they hadn't just been abandoned. They'd been systematically destroyed. Van. Clay's voice cracked as she read. Van, this says. I know what it says. The voice came from the warehouse entrance. Don Vito Moratti stood silhouetted against the fading daylight, his silver cane tapping against the concrete floor as he walked toward them. He looked older somehow, the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. Van stepped in front of Clay instinctively, his body a shield.
Father.
You shouldn't be here. Neither should you. Don Vito's gaze moved to the ledger in Clay's hands. But here we all are, standing in the ruins of choices made long before you were born. Clay found her voice, though it shook. You knew. You knew what happened to my family. Don Vito stopped a few feet away, his expression carved from stone and regret. I was 25 years old. My father was Don then. He made the decision. I didn't stop him. He paused, his weathered fingers tightening on his cane. The Ferraros wanted out. They wanted to take their evidence and their conscience and walk away. My father couldn't allow that. So he made them disappear. All of them, except one. Celeste, Clay whispered. Your grandmother. She was just a girl. 16 years old. She ran the night before the final purge. Don Vito's voice carried the weight of 50 years of guilt. I helped her escape. Gave her new papers, a new name, enough money to start over. I told myself that made it right. That saving one life balanced the scales. Van's voice was cold, harder than Clay had ever heard it. You let me believe the Ferraros betrayed us. You built our family's legacy on that lie. I built our family's survival on that lie, Don Vito corrected. The Chai family would have consumed us if they'd known the truth, that we were weak enough to let morality interfere with profit, that we'd splintered from within. He looked at Clay, something raw and human breaking through his armor. I am not asking for forgiveness. I'm simply telling you what cannot be changed. Clay felt the ledger burning in her hands. She could expose everything, bring down the entire Moratti empire, watch it crumble under the weight of its own sins. The Chai family would descend like vultures, tearing apart what remained. And nothing would change. More violence, more death. The cycle continuing forever, fed by revenge that fed more revenge. She thought of her grandmother, who'd spent 50 years hiding, teaching her granddaughter Sicilian through recipes and songs, waiting for the day when the truth might finally matter. Celeste hadn't taught her the language for vengeance. She'd taught it for something else entirely. For choice. Clay closed the ledger carefully. This ends now, she said quietly. Not with more blood. Not with revenge. It ends with the truth used the right way. Van turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. Clay, the Chai family wants leverage. They want to tear you apart. She looked between Van and Don Vito. But what if we give them something they can't fight? A united front. Ferraro and Moratti, standing together. Not hiding the past, but acknowledging it and choosing something different. Don Vito's expression shifted, surprise, then something that might have been relief. You would align yourself with us? After everything? I would align myself with the truth, Clay said. And with a future that doesn't require my grandmother to keep hiding. That doesn't require anyone else's grandmother to disappear. She looked at Van, her voice steadying. We use this ledger to create transparency. Real alliances based on legitimate business, not blood and fear. We dismantle what shouldn't exist and build something that can actually last. Van's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. That's dangerous. Revolutionary. It'll make enemies. We already have enemies, Clay said. At least this way, We choose what we're fighting for. Don Vito was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Your grandmother would have said the same thing. 50 years ago, she tried to tell us there was another way. His voice roughened. Perhaps it takes a new generation to finally listen. Clay tucked the ledger against her chest. Outside, the sun was setting over the pier, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, about the dialect that had saved her life and changed it forever, about the invisible waitress who'd accidentally called a ghost back to life. Sometimes the loudest act of courage is choosing peace when violence would be easier.